Michael here with IGN, and I am at Summer Game Fest, and I just played the game I've been looking forward to since it was announced, Stranger Than Heaven. I got to play a 3-part demo, and you know what? It's not quite what I expected. So to kick things off, combat works very different from any of the other RGG games you may have played. Yakuza, Like a Dragon, Judgment, any of those, this is very different. Yes, they have gone back to action combat, but it controls so differently from the action brawlers you may have played in the past. So the way this works, the bumpers and the triggers control each limb of the main character. So the right bumper is the right fist. The right trigger is the right foot, and the same for the left side. And you have to create these combos with each trigger pull and kind of be aware of the spatial area in which you are fighting all these enemies. And you can do some crazy things with it, where you can hold one enemy to the side, be punching another guy to the left side. It's a lot more complex than what RGG has done in the past. But the combat is also a lot more deliberate. It's a lot slower, and I wouldn't call it sluggish necessarily, but you do need to be a lot more thoughtful about the actions you take in combat. You can't just button mash. This is not a button masher at all. So the first part of the demo was pretty simple. I ran into a group of goons in the middle of the street, and I got to get my feet wet with how all of the different controls work. So it's a little tough when you're working with crowds, though. If you're fighting like 4 or 5 different enemies, because there isn't really a lock-on, it's more of like a magnetic targeting, it's a little hard to kind of get your head around who you're actually attacking when you press any of the inputs. But I think it allows for a lot more flexibility. You are in control of each attack, and you kind of need to think ahead of how you're going to control the character. And the thing about it being a little slower is that you can get locked into frame animations, and so the thing I'm getting my head around is what the frame timing is, because you also have a dodge and you also have a block, and those you absolutely need to know how to use. So you really need to wrap your head around how those things work, and you can get perfect timed dodges to create a slow motion and an opening in which you can really do some more damage. Or you can just rely on a block, but you also have a stagger meter that you need to worry about in the bottom left of the screen, and when enemies stagger you, you fall to the ground, and then it becomes a whole different thing where you just need to like wait it out or dodge their ground attacks. So there's a lot of ways in which you are vulnerable in a way you just haven't been in other action games from RGG Studio. So it's a very short demo, so I had very little time to actually get to grips with it. But once I got my head around directional dodges, that's the thing that you really need to learn. You can't just back away, you can't just dodge roll out of the way. You need to be a little bit more aggressive, and you need to dodge around characters so you can get the opening that you need to actually knock them out. And the way you also have command grabs works really well, where you pull both triggers, and then the character will go into a grab mode, throw them to the ground, and then you can do your own ground attacks. And this is happening while you're fighting a big group of guys. And again, like I said, you need to think about what your moves are, because again, you can get locked in these animations and you're vulnerable often. So the last part of the demo was really difficult. It was a 1v1 boss fight with what's ostensibly a super boss. And this is where I started to think to myself, is RGG doing Dark Souls style combat? Now, by no means are they trying to do a Dark Souls game. That's not what this is, and that's not what I'm saying. But it is this 1v1 boss fight where you take a lot of damage, they have a lot of health, and you kind of have to really be on top of your game lest you die in the middle of the fight. So I'm not gonna lie to y'all, it took me like 5 or 6 tries to defeat this guy. And maybe like Mr. Shakedown from Yakuza 0, that's a tough boss in that game, right? But he doesn't compare to this. After my 4th or 5th try, I got him down to like a sliver of health, and then there's another phase in which he has a one-hit attack, essentially knocks you to the ground and stabs you, and you're done. So that speaks to the difficulty that is part of Stranger Than Heaven. Now again, they were dropping us in the middle of the game, so after 10 minutes it's like, well, guess what, you're gonna have to learn how to fight one of the hardest bosses in the game. So I do think there will be a ramp up so you can hold your own against these kinds of bosses, but you also have to account for other things like the weapons that you have. So you don't just have fists, you have a crowbar, you have knives, and the way you cycle through those weapons to create openings can be an interesting aspect of the combat. So the demo I played here at SGF, again, was all combat. There was no story, but I think that was the #1 question I had going into this game. Of course, the showcases we saw before gave a deep dive into the kind of story that they're trying to tell, but this was the one question I had, was how combat was going to be, because they had stressed that they're going more in depth, and yes, they are. The thing is, I respect the approach. I'm not sure if I'm entirely on board yet. So difficulty is one thing, and I kind of like that RGG is focusing in on making their games a little bit more deeper when it comes to combat and challenging you a little bit more. I'm sure with time I can figure out deeper combos and how to get around these enemies, but for now, I'm focused on how movement works in this game because I think that's the part I'm getting hung up on. As someone who plays a lot of fighting games and has played all of RGG's action games, I think being nimble was the thing I liked a lot about those games, but this is very different and I just need to see more of it. So there was no story in this demo, but I did get to see what the rest of that world looks like. This is a game that takes place across 5 different cities in 5 different time periods in Japan's history. So to see all these different cities alive in a way that Kamurocho is in the old Yakuza games was really nice to see, and it feels like a generational jump in that regard. And if you haven't paid attention to any of the story that has been shown in showcases, this is one of RGG's boldest stories that they're going to tell. It's about a half Japanese, half American man who is escaping persecution in the United States, going back to Japan, but also struggling with the idea of finding a home. And this is such an interesting thing because if you've seen any of those demos or showcases, this is a game that focuses on music, and I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of it. Now, I didn't get to hear much of the soundtrack, but I think it's also a story theme where this is how he finds his connection with people in Japan and people in America. So Stranger Than Heaven is working with a lot of interesting ideas, including the fact that it is tied to the rest of the Yakuza games. The Tojo Clan is part of this story, and it is tied to that, but it's not exactly a prequel, and it's not exactly a direct relation to the Yakuza games, but it is sort of an origin story of how people push to the sides of society, how they find a living, how they survive in those streets, and the things that they resort to kind of tells you what the underground criminal organizations of Japan at the time were like and the reasons why those things exist. And that was part of the conversation I had with Masayoshi Yokoyama, the director of this game, when I did an interview. So I also asked them about the historical context in which they're working with, because this is a tumultuous time in the world, and especially with Japan, with World War II, Imperial Japan, and I asked about how that's going to impact the rest of the story, or how that's going to inform the things that happen to our main character. Of course, he said that we're going to have to wait for the game, but he also spoke to, again, what I mentioned about criminal organizations and the reasons why people resort to them in trying times. And that is kind of the ethos of the Yakuza series, right? You see a lot of characters who are desperate, who have to resort to these things, and the emotional stories that are attached to that. That's kind of the expectation going into Stranger Than Heaven. But also I think the bar is higher now because it is a game that takes itself more seriously. And he said, yes, there is a serious side of Yakuza, but it's also like a goofy game that has a lot of levity. But Stranger Than Heaven is trying to go for that more serious tone. And I think it kind of has to because it is working with more serious elements here, especially when you consider the history in which this game is taking place. There are a lot of elements they're working with there that I need to see for myself when this full game comes out. Now, there's no ignoring the fact that Tupac is in this game. Rest in peace to a legend, but he's been gone for 30 years, and I do think it's a little awkward to include him here. Yokoyama did mention that Snoop Dogg was part of the selection process for who this character was going to be, so maybe it's going to work. He did mention that there was a reason why they brought him in, because there's a theme of music in this game and the bridge between Japan and America and how that's a binding factor, but in a game that takes place between the early 1900s to 1960s, I'm not sure what they're trying to do here. And regardless of the fact that they said that they went to Tupac's estate and actually got approval for it, and everyone involved was excited about this inclusion, there's no denying the fact that someone who's been gone for 30 years is included in this, and I guess you'll just have to see for yourself. I am excited about the casting they have in this game. They have Tori Kelly, they have Ado, they have Snoop Dogg, who seems like a really interesting character who is going to be important to the story. And I still think RGG has it in them. They've been great storytellers in the past, and they've told emotional stories that I still remember to this day. But I hope they're not out of their depth with this. And again, this was just a gameplay and combat demo, but we'll see when the game comes out in January next year. We've seen so much more at Summer Game Fest, so for all of that, stick with IGN.